What if the strictest man you've ever met was hiding a secret that could shatter everything? A silent house, perfectly aligned furniture, and children who never step out of place. At first glance, it looks like control, like fear. But what if every rule was the only thing standing between survival and darkness? Tonight's story will take you deep into a world where strength wears the mask of cruelty, and where one woman discovers a truth that will change everything. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a revelation.
The Wyoming sun didn't just shine. It battered the earth. Maeve Jenkins stepped off the buckboard wagon, her boots raising a cloud of red dust that settled slowly around the hem of her practical cotton skirt. She gripped her canvas duffel in one hand and her prized cast-iron skillet in the other. At 38, after spending a decade cooking for foul-mouthed trail hands out of a chuck wagon, it took a lot to intimidate her. But the Thorn Ranch was trying its best. From the outside, the property looked like a man holding his breath. The fences were sturdy but desperately needed a coat of whitewash. The barn stood tall against the stark horizon, though the yard surrounding it was eerily devoid of the usual ranch chaos. No scattered tools, no stray buckets. With 6 kids, half of them Elias Thorne's blood, half taken in before his wife passed, Maeve had braced herself for a hurricane. She expected toys on the porch, mud tracking through the halls, and the deafening roar of feral youth. Instead, when she pushed open the heavy oak front door, she found a museum. The entryway was immaculate. The worn pine floorboards were swept clean. A row of boots sat lined up against the wall with military precision. At the end of the hall, leaning against the door frame of the kitchen, was a boy of about 14. He had eyes too old for his face and a posture that screamed defense. Behind him, peeking around his waist, was a little girl no older than 5. "You the new cook?" the boy asked, his voice cracking slightly, but his gaze steady. "Maeve Jenkins," she said, offering a curt nod. She wasn't one for excessive smiling. Out on the trail, a soft smile meant you were an easy mark. "You must be the oldest." "Caleb. This here is Lily. The others are out back." Caleb didn't move to help her with her bags. He just stared at her, assessing how long she'd last. "Pause in the study," he said, to send you straight in. Maeve set her skillet down on the entryway table. "Well then, let's not keep him waiting." As she walked down the hall, Maeve's sharp eyes catalogued the house. It wasn't just clean, it was rigid. Every chair in the dining room was pushed perfectly flush against the table. The hallway runner rug was centered to the fraction of an inch. There was a deliberate, almost unnatural geometry to the place. She knocked twice on the heavy study door and pushed it open. Elias Thorne was a mountain of a man. He stood with his back to her, facing the window, though the heavy curtains were drawn tight, letting in only slivers of the blinding afternoon sun. His shoulders stretched the seams of his faded chambray shirt, and his posture was as rigid as the dining room chairs. "Mr. Thorne, I'm Maeve Jenkins." He turned slowly. He was handsome in a rugged, weather-beaten way, with a strong jaw covered in dark stubble and eyes the color of a stormy sky. But there was something off about his gaze. It didn't lock onto her face immediately. Instead, it seemed to sweep the space around her before settling somewhere near her collarbone. "Miss Jenkins," his voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, "I assume you read the terms of the telegram. The pay is triple the usual rate for a cook and housekeeper." "I did," Maeve said calmly. "And frankly, Mr. Thorne, when a man offers triple pay to feed 6 kids, I assume the kids are either wild as coyotes or the man is impossible to work for. Which is it?" Elias's jaw twitched. A muscle feathered in his cheek. "The children pull their weight. It's me you'll have to tolerate. I have rules, Miss Jenkins. Rules that you will follow to the letter if you want to keep that generous wage." Maeve crossed her arms. "I'm listening." Elias stepped forward, his hand brushing the edge of his massive mahogany desk as he moved. "First, The furniture in this house stays exactly where it is. You do not move a chair to sweep under it and leave it out. Not an inch to the left, not an inch to the right. Second, if you open a cabinet, a door, or a drawer, you close it immediately. I will not tolerate open doors. Third, when you serve meals, the plates, glasses, and utensils go in the exact same spots every single time. Maeve narrowed her eyes. She'd worked for arrogant trail bosses and fussy landowners. But this wasn't mere perfectionism. This was a dictatorship of space. That's a tall order for a house with 6 children, she noted. The children already know the rules, Elias said coldly. See that you learn them. Your room is off the kitchen. Dinner is at 6 sharp. He turned his back to her again, dismissing her entirely. For the next 2 days, Maeve bit her tongue and did the work. She cooked, she scrubbed, and she watched. She noticed how Caleb and the older kids policed the younger ones, swatting their hands if they left a stool pulled out from the counter. She noticed how Elias walked with measured, deliberate strides, his right hand often grazing the wainscoting of the hallway. The man was a tyrant, she concluded, a grief-stricken, controlling tyrant holding his family in a suffocating grip. Until the 3rd night. It was past 10 o'clock. The kids were asleep. Maeve was exhausted, her bones aching from scrubbing the back porch. She had come inside to fetch a fresh bucket of water and, in her fatigue, left her heavy, stiff-bristled broom leaning carelessly against the wall in the middle of the dark hallway. She was at the kitchen sink when she heard the heavy thud of Elias's boots coming down the stairs. He didn't carry a lantern. He never did. Maeve turned just in time to hear a sharp curse, followed by a sickening crash. She dropped her rag and bolted to the hallway. Elias had tripped over the broom. He was sprawled on the floor, his massive frame tangled in the shadows. "Mr. Thorn!" Maeve rushed forward, expecting the infamous temper she'd heard the children whisper about. She braced herself for a roar of fury, for him to fire her on the spot for leaving the broom out. But the roar never came. Maeve froze halfway down the hall. Elias was on his hands and knees. He wasn't yelling. He was breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. In the moonlight spilling from the window, Maeve saw his face. It wasn't angry. It was utterly, desperately terrified. His large, calloused hands were sweeping wildly across the wooden floorboards, searching, feeling, patting the air. He found the wall and pressed his palm flat against it, his chest heaving as he muttered under his breath. 3 steps from the stairs. Door frame is 2 feet left. God damn it. Where is the door frame? He wasn't looking around. His wide, stormy eyes were staring straight ahead into the darkness, unblinking, unseeing. Maeve stopped breathing. The rigid furniture, the closed cabinets, the dragging hand against the wall, the refusal to carry a lantern. It all clicked together with the deafening force of a thunderclap. Elias Thorn wasn't a control freak. He was going blind. Before she could speak, Elias's hand found the broom handle. He gripped it so hard his knuckles turned white, using it to push himself up. He stood there in the dark, a proud, broken man trying to hide the fact that the world was fading away from him. Maeve slowly stepped back into the kitchen, her bare feet making no sound. She left him his dignity in the dark. But as she picked up her rag, her hands were shaking. The triple pay wasn't a wage, it was a ransom, and Elias Thorn was running out of time. The morning after the incident with the broom, the Thorn Ranch kitchen was heavy with the scent of frying bacon, strong chicory coffee, and unspoken tension. Maeve moved between the cast-iron stove and the massive oak table with practiced efficiency, sliding plates of eggs and biscuits into their exact mandated positions. She watched Elias from the corner of her eye. He sat at the head of the table, his posture as rigid as ever, a phantom of authority carved out of Wyoming granite. Caleb and the 5 younger children ate with their usual subdued rhythm, the clinking of their forks the only sound in the room. Elias didn't miss a beat. His hand moved to his coffee cup, placed precisely 3 inches from the edge of the table, right at the 2 o'clock position relative to his plate, with unwavering accuracy. To the children, he was just their strict, demanding father. But Maeve knew better now. She saw the microscopic hesitation before his fork pierced a biscuit. She noticed how he waited for little Lily to speak before turning his head, using sound to locate her, rather than sight. When the children finally scattered to tend to their morning chores, feeding the chickens, mucking the stalls, chopping wood, Elias stood. "The coffee was adequate, Miss Jenkins," he muttered, turning his broad back to head for the sanctuary of his study. "Hold on a minute, Mr. Thorn," Maeve said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed the unmistakable edge of a woman who was done playing games. Elias stopped in the doorway, his hand resting instinctively on the doorframe. "I have ledgers to balance. If you need supply money, it is in the tin on the "I don't need money," Maeve interrupted, drying her hands on her apron as she closed the distance between them. "I need the truth." He didn't turn around. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I'm talking about last night," Maeve said, keeping her voice low so it wouldn't carry out to the yard. "I'm talking about a broom left in the hallway. I'm talking about a man who maps his own house with his hands because his eyes are failing him." The silence that followed was so profound, Maeve could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the parlor. Elias's shoulders tensed, drawing up toward his ears like a wild animal cornered by a predator. When he finally turned to face her, the carefully constructed mask of the indomitable rancher was fracturing. His jaw was locked, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic breaths. "You are overstepping your bounds, Miss Jenkins. Pack your bags. I will pay you for the full month, but you will be gone by noon." "I'm not going anywhere," Maeve shot back, planting her boots firmly on the pine floorboards. "And you aren't firing me. Because if you fire me, you'll have to hire someone else. And the next woman might not be tight-lipped. The next woman might run down to the mercantile and tell the whole town that Elias Thorn is going blind." Elias flinched, as if she had struck him with a riding crop. The word blind hung in the air between them, ugly and absolute. He closed his eyes, and the fight seemed to drain out of his massive frame all at once. He suddenly looked 10 years older, a weary titan carrying a sky that was collapsing inward. "In here," he rasped, gesturing toward the study. Maeve followed him in and firmly shut the door behind them. Elias didn't sit at his desk. He walked to the window, staring out at a yard she now knew he could barely see. "Retinitis pigmentosa," he said, the medical term sounding foreign and harsh in his gravelly voice. "It started a year before my wife died. Night blindness first. I couldn't see the stars anymore. Then the edges of the world started closing in, like looking through a spyglass. Now, the spyglass is the size of a pinhole. In a few months, maybe less, the pinhole closes. And then it's just the dark." Maeve felt a hard lump form in her throat. "And the rules? The furniture? If nothing moves, I know where it is," he explained, his voice thick with a mixture of shame and fierce pride. "I memorized the steps, 3 paces from the desk to the door, 7 from the stairs to the kitchen. If a chair is moved, if a cabinet door is left open, my map is destroyed." "Why the secrecy?" Maeve asked softly, the anger bleeding out of her entirely. "Your children. Caleb is old enough to understand. He could help you." Elias spun around, his sightless gaze burning with sudden fierce intensity. "Help me? You think I want my son spending his youth leading his crippled father around by the hand? You think I want those children who have already lost their mother to look at me and see a helpless burden?" He slammed a fist onto the windowsill, making the glass rattle. "No, I am their father. I protect them. They do not protect me." "So what is the plan, Elias?" Maeve demanded, dropping the formal Mr. Thorn. "Because you can't fake this forever. You can't run a cattle ranch on memory." Elias walked slowly back to his desk, feeling for the edge of the mahogany before sinking into his leather chair. He looked utterly defeated. That is why you are here, Maeve. The triple pay wasn't just for cooking. It was a test. I needed to see if you were competent, if you were tough enough to handle this land and those kids. Maeve frowned, a cold knot forming in her stomach. A test for what? To take over, Elias said, his voice deadening. I have lawyers in Cheyenne drawing up the papers. In 2 months, the ranch, the accounts, and the legal guardianship of the children will be transferred to you. You'll have enough money to hire a proper foreman to run the cattle. You will manage the house. The children will be safe. And where will you be? Elias looked down at his hands that had built this ranch from raw dirt. There is a facility in Denver, a home for the blind. I leave on the train the day the papers are signed. Maeve stared at him, her chest heaving with a sudden violent rage. It wasn't the blindness that angered her. It was the absolute tragic stupidity of a proud man. You arrogant, selfish fool, she hissed, slamming her palms flat on his desk. Elias's head snapped up in shock. Excuse me? You heard me, Maeve leaned in. You think you're being a martyr. You think you're saving them. Have you even thought about what it will do to those kids to lose their mother to the grave and their father to his own damn pride? They don't need a perfectly functioning rancher, Elias. They need their father. A blind father is no father at all, Elias roared back. That is a lie, and you know it. Maeve didn't back down an inch. You are not a burden unless you choose to act like one. I am not signing your papers. I am not taking your children. I am not replacing you. Elias was breathing hard, his jaw working. Then what do you propose? Because the darkness is coming, Maeve, and I cannot stop it. Maeve rounded the desk. She stopped inches from him. Gently she reached out and laid her rough, flour-dusted hand over his trembling, calloused one. I am not taking your place, Elias, but I will stand beside you. I will be your eyes when you need them. We will train the children together, subtly, making it a game of responsibility rather than a chore of pity. You will not leave this ranch. You will adapt to it. Elias let out a ragged breath, leaning his head back. You don't know what you're agreeing to. It is a terrible thing to be trapped in the dark. Then it's a good thing I brought a lantern, Maeve said softly. And from that morning on, the dynamic of the Thorn Ranch shifted invisibly, fundamentally. To the children and to the outside world, nothing had changed. Elias was still the imposing patriarch, and Maeve was the sharp-tongued cook. But between the two of them, a secret choreography was born. Maeve became the phantom architect of Elias's independence. During meals, if a child pushed a water pitcher out of place, Maeve would casually slide it back into Elias's reach with a subtle scrape of glass against wood, signaling its location. If Elias needed to sign a ledger, Maeve would slide the paper forward, casually resting her index finger exactly where the pen needed to touch the paper. Sign right above my finger, boss, she would say, her tone light, masking the lifeline she was throwing him. Slowly, the paralyzing terror that had gripped Elias began to recede. He stopped locking himself in the study. With Maeve's subtle cues, a tap of her boot, the brush of her skirt, the distinct scent of her lye soap and cinnamon, he navigated the yard with renewed confidence. The turning point came 3 weeks later. It was early evening, the air cooling rapidly as the Wyoming sun prepared to dip below the jagged teeth of the Bighorn Mountains. Elias stood on the front porch, gripping the wooden railing. He was facing the horizon, but Maeve, stepping out with a dish towel in her hands, knew he couldn't see the spectacle unfolding. She walked up and stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Maeve spoke, her voice low and melodic. The sky is catching fire, Elias. It's bleeding out over the ridge, deep purple right at the top, fading into bruised plum, and then a streak of gold so bright it looks like liquid brass spilling across the clouds. Elias turned his head slightly toward her voice, his eyes unfocused, but his expression intently listening. The herd is down in the lower pasture, she continued, looking out at the grazing cattle. Caleb is riding Rusty. The gelding is acting up a bit, tossing his head, wanting to run back to the barn. But Caleb is holding him steady. The boy has your seat in the saddle. He's got your hands too, gentle but firm. Elias swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. He reached out, his hand sliding blindly along the railing until his knuckles bumped against hers. He didn't pull away. He turned his hand over, letting his rough fingers wrap around hers. "I can see it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "When you say it, Maeve, I can see it perfectly." Maeve looked up at his handsome, weathered face, realizing with a sudden, breathless jolt that she wasn't just helping an employer anymore. The pulse beating against her fingers was matching her own. She was looking at a man who was fighting a war in the dark, and all she wanted, with every fiber of her being, was to be his light. "Good," she murmured, squeezing his hand back. "Because tomorrow, we're fixing the hinge on the barn door, and I'm going to need you to tell me exactly how a blind cowboy swings a hammer without hitting his thumb." A slow, genuine smile, the first she had ever seen, broke across Elias's face, changing him completely. It was a smile that promised survival, and perhaps something beautifully unexpected. Winter arrived in Wyoming not with a whisper, but with a drawn blade. The first snow of the season was a heavy, wet blanket that froze solid overnight, turning the Thorn Ranch into a treacherous landscape of ice and jagged frost. But the weather was the least of their problems. Silas Vance was a man built like a barrel, with a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was a land speculator representing Eastern Railroad interests, and he had been circling the struggling ranches in the valley like a vulture. He arrived at the Thorn Ranch unannounced on a Tuesday morning, riding a magnificent black stallion that contrasted sharply with his own greasy demeanor. Maeve was sweeping the porch when Vance rode up. She felt a prickle of unease slide down her spine. Elias emerged from the house a moment later, walking with his measured, practiced strides, stopping exactly at the edge of the porch stairs. "Elias Thorn!" Vance boomed, dismounting. He walked up to the porch, his boots crunching loudly on the ice, and thrust his hand out for a shake. Elias didn't move. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on a point just past Vance's shoulder. Maeve's heart hammered against her ribs. Elias couldn't see the hand. Vance's fake smile faltered. He slowly lowered his hand, his small eyes narrowing as he scrutinized Elias's rigid posture, the slightly vacant stare. "Not one for pleasantries today, eh, Elias? No matter. I'll get straight to it. The winter's going to be brutal. Your herd is thin. I'm offering you a way out, a generous buyout for the land." "The land isn't for sale, Vance," Elias said, his voice flat and hard. "Every man has a price," Vance countered, taking a step closer, waving a gloved hand right in front of Elias's face. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Vance's eyes widened slightly, in malicious realization. A slow, cruel grin spread across his face. "Well, well. Rumors from town said you'd been acting strange, staying close to the house, making the hired help do the running. Now I see why. You're flying blind, aren't you, old man? The great Elias Thorn, a cripple." "Get off my property," Elias growled, his hands curling into fists. Vance chuckled, mounting his horse. "A blind rancher can't manage a winter herd, Elias. Nature will break you, or the cattle rustlers will. Sell now while you still have a dime to your name. Because if you lose that herd, the bank takes this land anyway, and you get nothing." He tipped his hat mockingly at Maeve. "Prepare to pack your bags, sweetheart. He's finished." As Vance rode away, Elias stood frozen, breathing heavily. Maeve stepped up beside him, ignoring the boundaries of employer and employee, and wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her cheek against his broad back. "Don't listen to him," she whispered. "He knows," Elias said, his voice laced with dread. "And he's right. If we lose the winter herd, we lose the ranch. The bank won't extend a loan to a blind man." 2 days later, Vance made his move to ensure nature did his dirty work. It started in the late afternoon. The sky bruised to a deep, terrible purple, and the wind began to howl, bringing with it a blinding horizontal snowfall. It was a whiteout blizzard, the kind that disoriented men and froze livestock where they stood. Maeve was in the kitchen, helping the younger children with their reading, when Caleb burst through the back door, covered in snow and panting wildly. "Pa! Maeve!" the boy yelled. Elias emerged from the study instantly. "Report, Caleb, what is it?" "It's the herd," Caleb gasped. "I was checking the north fence line. 2 men on horseback. They rode past and fired rifles into the air. They spooked the cattle. The whole herd is panicking, running toward the deep ravine at the edge of the property. In this snow, they'll run right off the cliff into the gorge." Vance's men. They were orchestrating a stampede to wipe out Elias's wealth in one fell swoop. "Saddle the horses," Elias commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "We have to cut them off at the ridge and turn them back into the box canyon." "Elias, no," Maeve cried, grabbing his arm. "You can't see your own hand in front of your face. In a whiteout blizzard, it's suicide." Elias turned to her, and for the first time she saw a terrifying, magnificent calm in his clouded eyes. "Maeve, listen to me. In a whiteout, a man with perfect vision is blind anyway. The snow blinds everyone. But out there, I don't need my eyes. I know every rock, every dip, every tree on this land. I have ridden it for 20 years. Saddle my horse." Maeve stared at him, realizing the absolute truth of his words. The playing field was leveled. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly. "Caleb, stay here with the little ones. Keep the fire going." "Like hell I'm staying," Caleb fired back, grabbing his rifle. "They're my cattle, too." 10 minutes later, the 3 of them were fighting their way through a maelstrom of white. The cold was a physical agony, biting through their heavy wool coats. The roar of the wind was deafening. But beneath it, Maeve could hear the terrifying, chaotic thunder of 300 terrified cattle running blind toward a deadly drop. "Stay close!" Elias roared over the wind. He was riding point on his massive bay gelding. Maeve rode his left flank, Caleb his right. Elias was a different man in the saddle. Without the need to pretend he could see, he gave himself entirely to his other senses. He felt the incline of the earth beneath his horse's hooves. He felt the direction of the biting wind slicing down from the peaks. He smelled the panic of the cattle and the ozone of the storm. "The ground is dipping," Elias shouted back to them. "We're nearing the creek bed. Veer left. The ravine is straight ahead. We have to outflank them on the high ground." Maeve trusted him blindly, literally. She spurred her horse left, following Elias's lead. They rode hard, plunging through snowdrifts, the storm erasing the world. Suddenly, through the swirling white, Maeve saw the dark, chaotic mass of the herd charging mindlessly toward the sheer drop of the gorge, just a quarter-mile away. "Now, Caleb!" Elias roared. "Fire over their heads! Maeve, ride to the edge and scream like hell. Turn them into the canyon." They descended on the herd like avenging angels. Caleb's rifle cracked over the roar of the wind, the muzzle flashes bright in the gloom. Maeve rode her horse to the very edge of the ravine, putting herself between the frantic beasts and the cliff, waving her hat and screaming at the top of her lungs. Elias rode directly into the fray, a blind king commanding his domain. He cracked his bullwhip, the sharp snap echoing like thunder. He didn't need to see the cattle. He knew exactly where the pressure point of the herd was. He drove his horse against the lead steers, forcing them to veer right, away from the cliff and into the natural high-walled sanctuary of the Box Canyon. For 30 grueling minutes they fought the storm and the beasts. Finally, the herd, exhausted and confused, funneled into the canyon, protected from the wind and safe from the drop. They had done it. The ride back to the house was slow and silent, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving them shivering and exhausted. When they finally put the horses away and stumbled into the warm, fire-lit kitchen, the younger children rushed them with blankets and tears. Later that night, the house was finally quiet. The storm raged outside, but inside the fire cracked warmly in the hearth. Maeve found Elias in his study. He was sitting in his chair, his hands resting on his knees. "You were magnificent out there," Maeve said softly, taking a seat across from him. "Vance is going to be furious when he realizes we saved the herd." Elias didn't smile. He turned his face toward the fire. "When the snow hit my face, the cold, the glare, something snapped, Maeve. The pinhole is gone, the shadows are gone." His voice broke on a ragged exhale. "I can't see the fire. I can't see anything at all. It's done." Maeve felt a tear slip down her cheek. She didn't offer pity. She stood, walked over to him, and knelt between his knees, taking both of his large, cold hands in hers. "Elias," she said softly, but her voice was as strong as iron. "Listen to me." "I have to leave, Maeve," he whispered, a tear escaping his sightless eyes. "The papers are ready. You saved the herd. You proved you can run this place. I won't be a burden to you." "Shut up, Elias Thorn," Maeve said fiercely. He blinked, startled. "You think you're a burden?" Maeve squeezed his hand so hard it hurt. "Today, in the blinding snow, you were the only one who could see the way home. You didn't just save your herd today. You saved me. You saved Caleb. You are the foundation of this family, and a house doesn't stand without its foundation." Elias shook his head. "Maeve, I am a blind man." "And I am a woman who is tired of wandering," Maeve countered, moving her hands up to cup his bearded jaw. "I don't need a protector, Elias. I don't need a boss. I need a partner. I need the man who rides into a blizzard with no eyes and commands the earth. I need you." Elias's breath hitched. He reached up, his rough hands trembling as they found her face. His thumbs traced her cheekbones, the line of her jaw, memorizing her in the dark. "You would tie yourself to a man who can never look at your face again?" "My face isn't the best part of me anyway," she laughed, though it was a wet, choked sound. "I'm asking you to stay, Elias. Not as my employer, not as my ward. Marry me. Let me be your eyes when the sun shines, and you can be mine when the storms come." Elias let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He leaned forward, burying his face in her neck, pulling her tight against his broad chest. "Yes," he breathed against her skin. "God help you, Maeve Jenkins. Yes." A year later, the Thorn Ranch was a different place. It wasn't a museum of rigid perfection anymore. It was alive. As Maeve walked up to the front porch carrying a basket of fresh eggs, she heard the sweet high chime of a brass bell. She had sewn small bells to the hems of the younger children's coats and hung wind chimes of different pitches near the barn, the coop, and the front door. The ranch was mapped in sound. She paused on the top step, smiling. Elias sat on the porch rocking chair. He was weaving a complex leather hackamore, his fingers moving with impossible speed and dexterity, relying entirely on touch. Beside him, Caleb was reading aloud from a farming ledger, while little Lily sat on Elias's boot, playing with a wooden horse. Elias stopped his weaving. His head tilted slightly, catching the scent of the crisp morning air and the faint sound of Maeve's boots on the wood. "You're lingering, Mrs. Thorne," Elias said, a warm, easy smile spreading across his face. His eyes were still clouded, but they held no fear. "Just admiring the view, Mr. Thorne," Maeve replied, walking over and placing a kiss on his weathered cheek. Elias reached up with unerring accuracy, catching her hand and pressing it to his lips. He lived in a world of perpetual darkness, but as he listened to the laughter of his children and held the hand of his wife, Elias Thorne knew he had never seen his life more clearly. Spring did not arrive gently in the Wyoming Territory. It tore through the valley with violent purpose, melting the winter snows into raging, muddy torrents that threatened to swallow the lower pastures. The air smelled fiercely of wet pine, churned earth, and the metallic tang of impending rain. For the Thorn Ranch, spring also meant calving season, the most perilous and profitable time of the year. For Elias Thorn, it was his first spring in total darkness. He stood in the center of the birthing barn, the air thick with the scent of hay blood and the musky odor of exhausted cattle. He didn't need eyes to know what was happening. His world was now constructed of rich, complex layers of sound and touch. He heard the ragged, rhythmic panting of a heifer in the corner stall. He heard the precise, calm slosh of warm water as Maeve wrung out a rag. He heard Caleb's boots shifting nervously in the straw. "She's struggling, Pa," Caleb said, his voice tight with adolescent worry. "The calf is breached. Front legs are bent back. I can't get a rope around the hooves." "Patience, Caleb," Elias rumbled, his voice a steady anchor in the dim barn. "Panic travels down the arm. The animal feels it." Elias stripped off his heavy coat, rolling his flannel sleeves up past his elbows. He navigated the barn with a fluid grace that still astonished the ranch hands they had recently hired. He didn't shuffle. He walked with purpose, counting his strides, feeling the slight dips in the hard-packed dirt floor through the soles of his boots. He stopped exactly at the edge of the stall. "Guide my hand to her flank, Maeve," Elias said. Maeve was there instantly. She didn't offer pity or hesitant warnings. She took his large, calloused hand and pressed it gently against the laboring cow's heaving side. "Right here, Elias. She's tired." Elias leaned in, letting his hands do the seeing. He felt the tension in the animal's muscles, the erratic thud of her heart, the unnatural bulge near her pelvis. He didn't just feel the physical shape. He felt the life inside, fighting to get out. Gently, speaking in a low, continuous hum that vibrated in his chest, he reached inside the birth canal. His mind painted a vivid picture of what his fingers touched. The slick, wet hide of the calf. The awkward angle of the knee joint. "I have it," he murmured. "Caleb, keep her head steady. Maeve, when I say pull, lean your weight into her shoulder." So, with excruciating care, Elias manipulated the calf's legs in the blinding dark, turning the joint, straightening the hooves, ignoring the cramping in his own forearms. "Now," he grunted. A collective groan echoed in the barn, followed by the wet, heavy slide of new life hitting the straw. A moment later, the sharp, bleating cry of a newborn calf pierced the air. "It's a bull calf, Pa," Caleb laughed, the relief washing over him. "Big and healthy." Elias stepped back, wiping his arms with a towel Maeve pressed into his hands. He couldn't see the calf, but he heard the mother's rough tongue washing it. Heard the shaky, tentative clatter of tiny hooves trying to find purchase on the earth. He smiled, a deep, satisfied expression. "You did good, Caleb," Elias said. "Clean them up. Maeve and I need to get ready for town." The mention of town instantly sobered the celebratory mood. It had been 6 months since Elias had lost his sight completely, and 4 months since he and Maeve had stood in the parlor with the circuit judge and exchanged vows. In all that time, Elias had not been to Cheyenne. He had let Maeve and Caleb handle the supply runs. But today was different. Today they had a meeting at the Territorial Bank. Silas Vance had not vanished with the winter snows. When brute force had failed to break the Thorn Ranch, Vance had turned to a weapon far more insidious: bureaucracy. "You don't have to go, Elias," Maeve said softly as they walked back to the house. The mud sucked at her boots, but she kept her arm lightly linked through his, acting as a subtle rudder. "I have the legal authority. You signed the power of attorney." "Vance is petitioning the bank to call in the loan early," Elias replied, his jaw set. "He's claiming the property is derelict because the primary leaseholder is legally incompetent. If I don't show my face, the bank manager will believe him. I will not hide on my own land, Maeve." "I know," she murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder for a brief second. "I just hate the way they'll look at you." "Let them look," Elias said fiercely. "I have nothing to be ashamed of." The ride into town was quiet. Elias sat tall in the wagon, the reins in his hands. Maeve sat beside him, giving him soft, almost imperceptible verbal cues. Slight right to avoid the rut. Wagon approaching on the left. To anyone passing by, it looked like a husband driving his wife to the market, but it was a masterclass in trust. When they arrived in Cheyenne, the bustling noise of the town hit Elias like a physical wave. The clatter of hooves on boardwalks, the shouts of merchants, the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer. It was chaotic, lacking the predictable rhythms of the ranch. He felt a brief spike of vertigo, the darkness swimming around him. Maeve's hand slipped into his, her thumb stroking his knuckles. 3 steps to the boardwalk, Elias. Then a straight shot to the bank doors. He stepped down from the wagon, his posture unyielding. As they walked down the wooden promenade, the town's normal chatter began to die down. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. That's Elias Thorn. Heard he went stark blind. Look at him, having to be led by that cook he married. Elias's grip tightened on Maeve's hand, but he didn't falter. He kept his head high, his eyes, striking, stormy, and completely sightless, fixed straight ahead. They entered the imposing stone building of the Territorial Bank. The hushed atmosphere inside was thick with the smell of cigar smoke, oiled leather, and polished brass. Ah, Mr. Thorn. Mrs. Thorn, a sleek, oily voice echoed in the lobby. Silas Vance. I'm surprised you made the trip, Elias. The roads are treacherous for a man in your condition. My condition is none of your concern, Vance, Elias said, turning precisely toward the sound of the man's voice. Actually, it is, Vance sneered, leading them into the bank manager's office. Mr. Abernathy, a nervous, bespectacled man, sat behind a massive mahogany desk. Mr. Abernathy and I were just discussing the Thorn Ranch lease. The railroad is ready to offer a premium for that acreage, Elias. The bank is nervous. A blind man cannot run a cattle empire. It's a liability. The loan payments have never been late, Maeve stated, pulling out a chair for Elias before taking her own. Elias sat smoothly, finding the armrests without fumbling. True, Mrs. Thorn, Abernathy stuttered, shuffling a stack of papers. But the terms of the original loan stipulate that the property must be managed by a capable, able-bodied operator. Mr. Vance has filed a formal grievance stating that Mr. Thorn is no longer legally competent to hold the debt. He has brought a medical affidavit. Signed by a doctor who has never examined me, Elias noted dryly. The facts are the facts, Elias, Vance said, leaning over the desk. You can't even read the contract you signed. You are an invalid. If the bank calls the loan today, you default, and I buy the land at auction next week. Sell to me now, and you walk away with enough money to live comfortably in a dark room somewhere. Maeve's blood boiled. She opened her mouth to unleash a tirade that would have made a trail boss blush, but Elias raised a single finger. The subtle command silenced her. Elias reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. He laid it flat on Abernathy's desk. You say I can't read the contract, Vance, Elias said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. Mr. Abernathy, turn to page 3, paragraph 4 of my original loan agreement. Abernathy blinked, frantically flipping through the heavy ledger on his desk. Yes, Mr. Thorn, I have it. Elias didn't move. He stared blindly across the desk. In the event of physical incapacitation of the primary signee, Elias recited from memory, every word ringing out like a tolled bell in the quiet office. The lease and all attached debts may be transferred in full, without penalty or calling of the principal, to a legally wedded spouse, provided said spouse demonstrates co-management of the property for a period no less than 90 days. Vance's smug smile vanished. Abernathy's jaw dropped. Is my recitation accurate, Mr. Abernathy? Elias asked softly. Word for word, Mr. Thorn, the banker squeaked. Elias leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. He couldn't see Vance, but he directed his voice with pinpoint accuracy toward the heavy breathing of the speculator. I have been married to Maeve for 4 months. She has been a co-signer on all supply accounts and cattle sales. I may not be able to read the paper, Vance, but my memory is flawless. I built that ranch from the dirt up. I know every rock, every blade of grass, and every legal loophole I ever signed my name to." "This is a trick," Vance hissed, his face turning red. "A parlor trick. A woman can't manage a winter herd." "She already did," Elias reminded him coldly. "When you tried to run them off a cliff in a blizzard. We saved them. Every last head." Elias stood up, towering over the desk. He didn't wait for Maeve to guide him. He reached out, his fingertips brushing the brass nameplate on the desk to orient himself, and turned flawlessly toward the door. "The loan remains as it is, Abernathy," Elias commanded. "And Vance, if I ever hear that you or your men have stepped foot near my fence line again, I won't need my eyes to find you. I'll smell the cowardice on you from a mile away." Maeve stood, her chest swelling with a pride so fierce it almost brought her to tears. She looked at Vance's pale, furious face, then turned and walked out behind her husband. When they reached the wagon, the whispers in the street had changed. They weren't looking at a crippled man being led by his cook anymore. They were looking at a king who had just defended his castle. Elias climbed into the wagon, his hands finding the reins. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension finally leaving his massive frame. Maeve climbed up beside him. She didn't say a word. She just leaned over, gripped the lapels of his coat, and kissed him hard, right there in the middle of the main street for all of Cheyenne to see. When she pulled back, Elias was grinning, a true, brilliant smile that reached the corners of his scarred, sightless eyes. "Wagon approaching on the left, Elias," Maeve whispered against his lips. "Let's go home." By early June, the Thorn Ranch was an oasis of emerald green against the harsh, rocky backdrop of the Bighorn Mountains. The winter snowmelt had finally ceased its violent rush, settling the creeks into steady, manageable flows. The herd was fat, the calves were strong, and the shadow of Silas Vance had been banished completely from their valley. The rhythm of the ranch had synchronized flawlessly with Elias's darkness. The children no longer tiptoed around him. They actively engaged him in their world. Caleb had become his father's right-hand man, translating visual details into rich verbal descriptions. The younger children treated Elias's blindness not as a tragedy, but as a unique puzzle to solve. They described the colors of the wildflowers they picked. They brought him newborn barn kittens so he could feel the softness of their fur and hear their tiny mews. And Maeve? Maeve was the heartbeat of it all. She was the mortar holding the bricks of the family together. It was a blistering Tuesday afternoon when the serenity of the summer was shattered. Maeve was in the kitchen garden, her hands deep in the warm, dark soil, pulling weeds from the tomato plants. Elias was in the barn, repairing a complex set of leather harnesses. He had developed an uncanny ability to fix tack by touch, his fingers finding frayed edges and weak buckles that a seeing man might miss. Suddenly, the sharp, terrified scream of a child tore through the heavy summer air. Maeve dropped her trowel, her heart leaping into her throat. She recognized the pitch instantly. It was Lily, the 5-year-old. The scream came from the direction of the Washakie Creek, a fast-moving offshoot of the main river that bordered the southern edge of their property. It was usually shallow enough to wade across, but a recent unseasonal thunderstorm upstream had caused it to swell dangerously. "Lily!" Maeve screamed, sprinting past the barn. Elias burst through the barn doors a split second later, his head snapping side to side like a radar dish. He couldn't see the frantic movement of Maeve running, but he heard the sheer terror in her voice. "Maeve, where?" Elias roared. Elias, "The creek," she yelled back over her shoulder, not stopping. Elias ran. He didn't use a cane, and he didn't wait for a guide. He had memorized the topography of the yard down to the inch. He knew exactly how many strides it took to reach the edge of the tree line, knew where the ground sloped downward toward the water. He ran with a terrifying, reckless speed, trusting his memory, and the sound of Maeve's receding footsteps. When Maeve reached the bank, the sight froze the blood in her veins. The creek was no longer a babbling brook. It was a churning, muddy torrent of white water, thick with broken branches and debris. A large, dead cottonwood tree had washed down and become wedged against a cluster of rocks in the center of the rapids. Clinging to a fragile, violently shaking branch of that dead tree, waist-deep in the freezing, rushing water, was Lily. She had been chasing a stray barn cat, and the bank had given way beneath her. The water was dragging at her small body, threatening to pull her under the tangled roots of the dead tree where she would surely drown. "Mama Maeve!" Lily shrieked, her tiny face white with terror. "Hold on, sweetheart. I'm coming." Maeve threw off her boots and waded into the water. The current hit her like a physical blow, instantly sweeping her feet out from under her. She crashed into the icy water, swallowing a mouthful of mud before managing to scramble back to the muddy bank, gasping for air. The water was too fast. She wasn't heavy enough to fight the current. Elias crashed through the brush behind her, his chest heaving. "Maeve! Status!" "She's in the middle of the creek!" Maeve screamed over the roar of the water, panic finally fracturing her composure. "She's clinging to a dead tree. The current is too fast, Elias. It knocked me right back. If that branch breaks, it'll pull her under the roots." Elias didn't hesitate. He stripped off his heavy leather boots and his gun belt. "Talk to me, Maeve. Where is she relative to where I'm standing?" "Straight ahead," Maeve said, grabbing his arm, her hands shaking violently. "About 20 yards out. But Elias, you can't see the debris. There are logs washing down." "I don't need to see them. I'll feel them," Elias said, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm register he only used in matters of life and death. He turned his face toward the roaring water, tuning out the chaos, isolating the specific frequency of Lily's high-pitched sobbing. He stepped into the water. The icy current slammed into his thighs, but Elias Thorn was built like a mountain pine. He dug his bare heels into the rocky creek bed, feeling his way forward. "A little to your left, Elias," Maeve yelled from the bank, pacing frantically. "The water gets deeper there. Stay right." Elias adjusted his path, moving blindly through the raging torrent. The water rose to his waist, then his chest. A heavy, submerged branch struck his thigh, bruising the muscle, but he grunted and pushed it away. He used the current itself as a guide, feeling how the water flowed around the obstacle of the dead tree ahead. "Papa!" Lily screamed. "Keep talking, Lily!" Elias bellowed over the roar. "Sing out, baby girl! Be my lighthouse!" Through her tears, the terrified 5-year-old started to wail a disjointed, panicked version of Amazing Grace. It was the song Maeve sang while baking. Elias locked onto the sound. He waded deeper, the water pulling fiercely at his broad chest. He reached the churning eddy surrounding the dead cottonwood. The roots were a deadly, invisible snare beneath the surface. "Elias, stop!" Maeve screamed from the bank. "The branch she's holding is cracking. You have to reach out. 2 feet in front of you, slightly right." Elias planted his feet, bracing his massive weight against the rock bed. He reached his long arms out into the empty air, feeling nothing but the spray of the water. Crack! The sound of snapping wood cut through the roar of the river. Lily shrieked as the branch gave way, the current instantly sucking her small body down toward the deadly root system. Elias lunged. He didn't see her fall. He felt the sudden shift in the water pressure, heard the splash of her impact. He plunged his arms into the freezing water, sweeping blindly in the chaotic current. His rough, calloused hand brushed wet cotton. With a roar of exertion, Elias closed his fist around the fabric of Lily's dress. He hauled back with all his immense strength, dragging the choking, sputtering child out of the icy water and crushing her against his chest. "I have her!" Elias bellowed toward the bank, wrapping his giant arms around the tiny, shivering girl, shielding her from the rushing debris. "I have her, Maeve!" Maeve collapsed to her knees in the mud, sobbing uncontrollably. Guided by Maeve's tearful voice, Elias fought his way backward through the current, step by agonizing step, until he reached the shallows. Maeve rushed into the water, wrapping her arms around both of them, dragging them up onto the muddy bank. They collapsed in a heap on the wet grass. Lily was coughing and crying, clinging to Elias's neck like a monkey, her face buried in his soaking wet shirt. Elias was breathing heavily, his sightless eyes closed, his large hands gently stroking the girl's matted hair. Maeve pressed her forehead against Elias's shoulder, her hands tracing his face, his chest, making sure he was whole. "You crazy, stubborn, magnificent fool," she wept, kissing his wet cheek, his jaw, his blind eyes. "You did it. You found her," Elias turned his head, his lips finding Maeve's forehead. He smelled of river mud, adrenaline, and pure, unfiltered love. "I wasn't blind out there, Maeve," he whispered, his voice trembling for the first time. "I had your voice. I'm never blind when I have you." The sun was setting, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of bruised plum and liquid brass. Colors Elias would never see again, but colors he knew by heart. The ranch was quiet. The children, exhausted from the day's terror and subsequent relief, were asleep in their beds. Lily was tucked safely in the loft, clutching the wooden horse Elias had carved for her. Elias sat in his rocking chair on the front porch. He was freshly bathed, wearing clean flannel, a warm blanket draped over his legs. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of blooming sage and the distant rhythmic lowing of the cattle in the box canyon. The screen door creaked open. Maeve stepped out carrying 2 mugs of hot coffee. She didn't say a word. She walked over, pressed a mug into Elias's waiting hand, and sat down on the wooden steps, leaning her back against his long legs. Elias rested his free hand on the crown of her head, his fingers gently tangling in her hair. "Caleb secured the creek fence," Maeve said softly, taking a sip of her coffee. "The water is already going down." "Good," Elias murmured. They sat in comfortable, profound silence. There was no need for grand declarations. The life they had built was a grand declaration in itself. They had taken a shattered family, a failing ranch, and a terrifying diagnosis, and they had forged it into something unbreakable in the fires of the American West. Elias listened to the wind chiming the brass bells hanging from the porch eaves. He felt the sturdy warmth of his wife leaning against him. He felt the solid, unyielding earth of his ranch beneath his boots. He had lost his sight, yes. The darkness was total and permanent. But as Elias Thorn rocked slowly on his porch, listening to the steady breathing of the woman who had saved him, he realized a profound truth. He didn't need eyes to see the beauty of his life. He felt it in every heartbeat, in every touch, in every echoing sound of the home they had built together. And in the dark, Elias smiled, finally and completely at peace. Welcome to a channel where we tell stories of the Wild West, Western love, motherhood, human compassion, and the deep bonds that connect us all. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to support more meaningful stories like this. September arrived in the Wyoming Territory, painting the Bighorn Valley in brilliant strokes of amber, burnt orange, and pale dying gold. The brutal heat of the summer broke, replaced by a crisp, biting chill that hung in the air from dusk until mid-morning. For a man with sight, the transition was a visual feast. For Elias Thorn, the change of seasons was a symphony of textures and scents. He knew autumn by the brittle crunch of frost-hardened grass beneath his boots. He knew it by the sharp, metallic smell of the cold wind sweeping down from the mountain peaks, and by the changing pitch of the river, which had slowed from a roaring spring torrent to a quiet, steady murmur. The ranch was thriving, the winter calves were robust, the haylofts were bursting with feed, and the house hummed with the predictable, comforting rhythm that Maeve had orchestrated. Yet the tranquility of the season was about to be violently interrupted, not by nature, but by the ghosts of the past. It happened on a Tuesday, just past noon. Elias was in the corral, running a currycomb over the flank of a restless roan mare. His hands moved with expert precision, reading the tension in the horse's muscles, soothing the animal with a low, vibrating hum. Maeve was on the porch, a basket of late-season apples at her feet, a paring knife moving deftly in her hands. Elias stopped mid-stroke. He turned his head toward the long dirt road leading to the ranch property. "Company," Elias said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. Maeve paused, her knife hovering over a red apple. She looked down the road but saw nothing but dust and heat shimmers. "I don't see anyone, Elias. You sure? It ain't the supply wagon day." "It's a carriage," Elias stated with absolute certainty, stepping out of the corral and latching the gate behind him. 4 horses, heavy iron-shod wheels. Not a buckboard, not a ranch wagon. The springs are coiled steel, not leaf. Expensive. He wiped his hands on a rag, his brow furrowing. And they're driving too fast for this road. 10 minutes later, a sleek, black lacquered carriage pulled by 4 matched grays crested the ridge and rolled into the yard. It was a vehicle built for the paved streets of Boston or Philadelphia, utterly absurd against the rugged Wyoming landscape. The carriage halted, the horses snorting and stamping their feet. The driver, dressed in a sharp livery, scrambled down to open the door. Maeve wiped her hands on her apron and stood up, her instincts instantly on high alert. The children, who had been playing near the barn, stopped and stared, moving instinctively closer to the house. Caleb, carrying a pitchfork, stepped out of the barn, his eyes narrowing at the foreign intrusion. A man stepped out of the carriage. He was in his late 60s, dressed in an immaculate charcoal-gray 3-piece suit that cost more than a prime herd of cattle. He held a silver-tipped walking stick, not for support, but for authority. His face was sharp, aristocratic, and deeply lined with perpetual disapproval. Elias stood perfectly still in the center of the yard. He couldn't see the man's tailored suit or the silver cane, but he smelled the heavy, cloying scent of imported bay rum cologne and expensive cigar smoke. Elias's jaw locked. Arthur! Arthur Pendleton, the father of Elias's late wife, Anne, struck his cane against the hard-packed dirt of the yard. Elias, it has been a long time. Too long, considering what I've recently been informed of. Maeve walked down the porch steps, placing herself strategically between the carriage and the children. "Mr. Thorn, do we have a guest?" she asked, her tone polite but laced with steel. Arthur turned his piercing, icy gaze upon Maeve. He looked her up and down, taking in her flour-dusted apron, her sensible boots, and the unapologetic set of her shoulders. His lip curled in an unmistakable sneer. "And you must be the hired help. Or, as my associates in Cheyenne informed me, the hired help who somehow manipulated her way into a marriage license." "That is my wife you are speaking to, Arthur," Elias rumbled, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. "You will address her with respect, or you will get back in that carriage." Arthur scoffed, taking a step closer to Elias. He waved a hand in front of Elias's face, a cruel, testing gesture. Elias didn't blink, he didn't flinch. He just stood there, a mountain of quiet fury. "My God," Arthur breathed, a mixture of horror and vindication in his voice. "The rumors were true. You really are blind, a blind, helpless cripple trying to run a ranch and raise my grandchildren." "I am neither helpless nor a cripple," Elias replied, his voice terrifyingly calm. "State your business, Arthur. It's a long ride back to the train station in Cheyenne." "My business is my blood," Arthur snapped, turning his attention to the children. He spotted Caleb and Lily. "Caleb, look at you. You look like a farmhand. And Lily, my God, the child is filthy." Lily hid behind Caleb's leg. Caleb gripped his pitchfork tighter, his jaw jutting out in a mirror image of his father's stubbornness. "We're working, grandfather. It's a ranch." "Not for much longer," Arthur declared, turning back to Elias. "I received a letter from a Mr. Silas Vance a month ago. He detailed your condition. He detailed the squalor these children are living in, your near bankruptcy, and your desperate marriage to a common cook to save your own skin." Maeve let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Silas Vance is a lying snake who tried to steal this land and failed. And if you believe a word he wrote, you're a fool." "I do not speak to servants," Arthur hissed at Maeve before rounding on Elias. "I have not come to argue, Elias. I have come with a court order from a federal judge in Boston, recognized by the territorial governor here. I am petitioning for emergency, full custody of Anne's children. I am taking them back east, where they will be properly educated, properly cared for, and raised in a civilized society, not in the dirt with a blind man who cannot even see their faces." The silence that fell over the yard was absolute. The wind seemed to stop. Elias felt as though the earth had suddenly dropped out from beneath his boots. The darkness around him, usually a familiar companion, suddenly felt suffocating, heavy, and terrifying. They were using his blindness against him again. Not to take his land this time, but to rip his heart from his chest. "You will not take my children," Elias said, his voice vibrating with a barely contained roar. "They are my blood, and they are the children I chose to raise when Anne brought them to me." "You are unfit," Arthur shouted, slamming his cane down. "Look at yourself. You cannot protect them. You cannot provide for them. You are a broken man clinging to a piece of dirt, forcing my daughter's children to suffer for your pride." Maeve saw the exact moment the words pierced Elias's armor. It was the same fear he had harbored in the study months ago, the fear that he was indeed a burden. His broad shoulders slumped a fraction of an inch. Maeve moved. She closed the distance between them, ignoring Arthur completely, and grabbed Elias's hand, lacing her fingers tightly through his. She didn't whisper reassurances. She didn't coddle him. She stood beside him, a united front of iron and grit. "Arthur," Maeve said, her voice ringing out clear and loud across the yard. "You are standing on land that is owned, free and clear, by Elias Thorn. You are insulting a man who rode into a whiteout blizzard completely blind to save his herd. A man who dove into a raging river to pull that little girl from the jaws of death while you were sipping brandy in a parlor 1,000 miles away. You do not know the first thing about strength, and you know even less about this family." Arthur's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. "How dare you speak to me? No, how dare you?" Caleb's voice cut through the air. The 14-year-old boy stepped forward, dropping his pitchfork. He walked until he was standing shoulder to shoulder with Maeve and Elias. He looked his wealthy grandfather straight in the eye, and there was no trace of intimidation in the boy's face. He looked exactly like a Western rancher. "I remember you, grandfather," Caleb said, his voice steady. "I remember you telling my mother she was throwing her life away marrying a cowboy. I remember you never coming to visit when she was sick. You didn't care about us then. Caleb, I am trying to save you from this ruin," Arthur pleaded, losing his authoritarian edge under the boy's hard stare. "You can go to Harvard. You can have the world. I have the world right here." Caleb gestured to the ranch, to the mountains, to his family. "My pa is blind, yeah, but he sees more than you ever will. He taught me how to break a horse, how to calve a heifer, how to be a man. And Maeve is our mother now. She fought for us when no one else would." Caleb turned and looked at his younger siblings. "Anyone want to go to Boston with the man in the fancy suit?" The 5 younger children, from the 8-year-old twins to little Lily, aggressively shook their heads. Lily ran forward and wrapped her small arms tightly around Elias's thick leg, burying her face in his denim trousers. Elias reached down, his large hand finding Lily's head with unerring precision, stroking her hair. He stood taller, the momentary doubt banished completely by the fierce loyalty of his son. "You have your answer, Arthur," Elias said, his voice returning to its calm, unyielding resonance. "The court order means nothing if the children are old enough to testify to a territorial judge about their treatment. I have the bank manager, the local sheriff, and half the county who will swear that this ranch is thriving and these children are safe." Arthur Pendleton looked at the family arrayed before him, a blind giant, a fierce, flower-dusted woman, and 6 dirt-smudged, unshakable children. He realized with a sinking feeling of utter defeat that all his money and all his societal power were completely useless here. He was fighting a fortress made of devotion, and he had no weapons that could breach it. "You are making a terrible mistake," Arthur sneered, though the fire had gone out of his voice. He turned sharply on his heel, his cane tapping a rapid retreat. "You will ruin them, Elias." "Goodbye, Arthur," Elias said to the retreating footsteps. "Tell your driver to mind the rut near the creek on the way out. It'll snap an axle if he takes it too fast." Arthur didn't reply. He climbed into the carriage, slamming the door shut. The driver cracked the whip and the carriage lurched forward, disappearing down the road in a cloud of Wyoming dust. Silence descended on the yard once more, broken only by the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods. Elias let out a long, shuddering breath. He dropped to one knee, wrapping both arms around Lily, and then held his other arm out. Caleb stepped into the embrace, followed quickly by the twins and the other boys. They collapsed into a tangled heap of limbs, tears, and overwhelming relief. Maeve stood back, giving them the moment, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. After a long minute, Elias stood up. He reached out his hand into the empty space beside him. "Maeve?" She stepped forward, placing her hand in his. "I'm right here, Elias. I'm not going anywhere." "I know," he whispered, pulling her into his chest, burying his face in her hair. "I know." That night, after the children were asleep, Elias and Maeve sat on the front porch. The air was frigid, the stars blazing like diamond dust across the pitch-black sky. Elias held a piece of smooth pine wood in his hands, running a whittling knife over it with slow, meditative strokes. "He almost had me, Maeve," Elias confessed quietly into the darkness. "For a second there, when he said I couldn't even see their faces, it hit the deepest, ugliest fear I have, that I'm cheating them out of a real father." Maeve reached over, resting her hand over his, stopping the knife. "Elias Thorn, you listen to me. A father isn't someone who just looks at his children. A father is someone who shows up, who stands between them and the fire, who teaches them how to be brave." Arthur Pendleton has perfect eyesight, and he couldn't see the incredible boy standing right in front of him. He only saw dirt. Elias turned his face toward her. The moonlight caught the silver scars around his clouded eyes. "And what do you see, Maeve?" Maeve smiled, leaning in to kiss his rough, stubbled cheek. "I see a man who doesn't need eyes to know exactly where his heart belongs. Now put the knife away before you whittle that pine block into nothing. It's freezing out here and my toes are numb." Elias chuckled, a deep, rich sound that seemed to chase away the last lingering shadows of Arthur Pendleton's visit. He stood, pulling Maeve up with him. "Then let's go inside, Mrs. Thorn. I know the way perfectly." The second winter on the Thorn Ranch arrived not with the violent, screaming blizzards of the previous year, but with a quiet, majestic grace. Heavy, soft flakes fell steadily for 3 days in late November, blanketing the valley in pristine, untouched white. The world became muffled, insulated, and deeply peaceful. Inside the ranch house, the air was warm, smelling of burning cedar, roasting venison, and the sharp, sweet scent of cinnamon and cloves. It was Thanksgiving Day, a holiday they had decided to celebrate not just for the harvest, but for the sheer miraculous fact of their survival. A year ago, Maeve had arrived as a hired cook to a house ruled by fear and rigid geometry. Today, she stood at the center of a chaotic, joyful home. The oppressive rules were gone. Chairs were left pulled out. Boots were discarded haphazardly by the door. Toys littered the braided rugs. And Elias thrived in the middle of it all. He sat in a large armchair near the hearth. He had adapted to the chaos with a brilliance that constantly amazed Maeve. When a toy was left on the floor, he didn't trip. His feet had learned a sweeping, sliding motion, a gentle shuffle that pushed obstacles aside before he put his full weight down. He used the subtle echoes of the room, the way sound bounced off an open cabinet door versus a closed one, to navigate the shifting environment. He was no longer a man trapped in the dark. He was a man who had made the dark his own. Presently, he was holding a small, intricately carved wooden figure. Over the past few months, Elias had taken up woodworking. Without sight, his sense of touch had heightened to an almost supernatural degree. He could feel the grain of the wood, the microscopic imperfections, the exact depth of a chisel cut. Lily was standing between his knees, her small hands resting on his forearms. "Is it a horse, Papa?" Lily asked, her breath puffing against his hand. Elias smiled, his thumbs tracing the smooth, sanded curves of the wood. "Not just any horse, little bird. Feel the mane. See how it sweeps to the left? And feel this right here, the small notch on the ear." Lily's tiny fingers traced the wood. "It's rusty. Caleb's horse. Exactly, Elias laughed, handing her the carving. Go show Caleb. Tell him if he doesn't clean the real Rusty's hooves today, he'll have to ride this wooden one. Lily giggled and darted off toward the kitchen where Caleb and the twins were supposed to be peeling potatoes. Maeve watched him from the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She felt a profound, overwhelming swell of emotion. Her chest felt tight, her heart beating a frantic, joyful rhythm against her ribs. She had a secret of her own, one she had been holding close to her chest for 3 weeks, waiting for exactly the right moment. She walked over and sat on the arm of his chair, resting her hand on his broad shoulder. You're spoiling them, Elias. Wooden horses, new leather boots for the boys. We're going to ruin them. Elias reached up, his hand instantly finding hers, lacing their fingers together. They spent enough time being ruined by grief, Maeve. A few wooden toys and warm boots won't hurt. Besides, the herd brought a premium price in Cheyenne this fall. We have money in the bank. Silas Vance is probably chewing on his own hat. Let him, Maeve smiled, leaning her head against his. Dinner will be ready in an hour. The turkey is resting. Good. Because I have something I need to talk to you about, Elias said, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more serious. He stood up, gently pulling her up with him. Walk with me to the study. Maeve's brow furrowed slightly, but she let him lead the way. He navigated the hallway flawlessly, opening the study door and closing it behind them, sealing them in the quiet sanctuary. The fire in the study grate crackled softly. Elias walked over to his desk. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a large, heavy object wrapped in a thick wool blanket. He set it on the desk and turned toward her, tracing the air until he found her shoulders stepping close. I have been working on this for 2 months, Elias said softly. Mostly at night, when the house is asleep. Caleb helped me with the joints, but I did the carving. He reached back and pulled the blanket away. Maeve gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. It was a cradle. But it wasn't just a simple wooden box. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. The wood was dark, polished walnut, smooth as glass. The rockers were perfectly curved, but it was the side panels that took her breath away. Elias had carved a sprawling, intricate relief into the wood. Without seeing it, relying entirely on touch and memory, he had carved the Bighorn Mountains. He had carved the shape of the ranch house, the barn, the sweeping branches of the cottonwood trees. It was a tactile map of their world, designed so that a child could trace their home with their fingertips before they could even walk. Tears, hot and fast, spilled over Maeve's eyelashes. Elias, my God, it's beautiful. Why did you build this? Elias stepped closer, his large hands cupping her face. His thumbs gently wiped away her tears. His sightless eyes were looking down at her, filled with an emotion so deep it anchored her soul. I noticed 3 weeks ago, Elias whispered, his voice thick and reverent. I notice everything about you, Maeve. I noticed that you stopped drinking coffee in the mornings. I noticed the slight change in your breathing when you climb the stairs. And at night, when I hold you, I can feel the change in your pulse. There is a second tiny heartbeat drumming against my chest. Maeve let out a choked sob, burying her face in his chest, her arms wrapping fiercely around his waist. I wanted to tell you today. I was going to tell you at dinner. I didn't know if you'd be happy or if you'd be scared. Scared, Elias interrupted, wrapping his massive arms around her, crushing her to him. Maeve, it is the greatest gift of my life. He buried his face in her hair, his own chest heaving with emotion. I won't ever be able to see their face, Maeve. I won't see if they have your eyes or my chin, but I will know them. I will know the sound of their laugh. I will know the weight of them in my arms. I will carve them wooden horses and teach them how to hear the rain coming. I know you will, Maeve wept, looking up at him, kissing his jaw, his lips, the scarred tissue around his eyes. You are the best father in the world, Elias Thorn. You see more than any man I have ever known. They stood there in the quiet study, holding each other, surrounded by the scent of walnut wood and burning cedar. The fear, the trauma, the ghosts of the past, they were all gone, swept away by the undeniable, terrifyingly beautiful force of what they had built together. An hour later, they sat at the massive oak dining table. The food was a chaotic, glorious feast. Turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and steaming biscuits. The 6 children were laughing, passing plates, arguing over the last leg of poultry. Elias sat at the head of the table. He didn't demand silence. He didn't enforce rigid rules. He sat back, a profound, peaceful smile on his face, listening to the symphony of his family. He heard Caleb teasing the twins. He heard Lily humming Amazing Grace as she ate. He felt Maeve's hand resting warmly on his thigh beneath the table. Elias raised his glass of cider. He didn't tap it with a spoon. He just cleared his throat, a deep rumble that instantly commanded the room's respect. The children fell silent, looking toward their father. "We have a lot to be thankful for this year," Elias said, turning his head slowly, taking in the presence of each child, locking onto their specific breathing patterns, their unique rustle of clothing. "We survived the blizzards. We survived the fires. We kept this land." He reached out and found Maeve's hand, lifting it to the table for everyone to see. "But most importantly," Elias continued, his voice ringing with absolute certainty, "we found our way out of the dark. And next summer we're going to need a bigger table, because your mother and I are expecting a baby." The table erupted. Caleb let out a whoop of pure joy, slamming his hand on the table. The twins started cheering, arguing instantly over whether it would be a boy or a girl to even the odds. Lily scrambled out of her chair, running to Maeve and throwing her arms around her neck, asking if the baby could sleep in her room. Elias sat amidst the beautiful, deafening roar of his family. He couldn't see the tears of joy on Caleb's face, or the radiant, glowing smile on Maeve's. He couldn't see the snow falling gently outside the window, painting the Wyoming frontier in white. But he didn't need to. Elias Thorne closed his eyes, holding his wife's hand tightly in his own. He was a blind man in a rugged, unforgiving world, but his life was filled with an unimaginable, blinding light. And for the rest of his days, the horizon would never be dark again. January did not fall upon the Bighorn Valley. It entombed it. For 3 relentless weeks, the sky was a bruised, featureless gray that dumped foot after foot of heavy, wet snow across the territory. The Thorn Ranch became an island in a vast frozen ocean. The fence lines disappeared completely. The road to Cheyenne was nothing more than a memory, buried beneath impassable drifts. Inside the house, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, simmering stews, and the close, intimate warmth of 8 bodies living shoulder to shoulder. Maeve was 5 months pregnant, her belly a pronounced, beautiful curve that Elias traced every evening with reverent hands. Despite the claustrophobia of the long winter, there was no panic. They had prepared. The root cellar was full, the firewood was stacked high against the covered porch, and the family had fallen into a tight, cooperative rhythm. Elias had turned the parlor into a makeshift classroom and workshop. He spent the mornings drilling Caleb and the twins on their mathematics, doing the calculations entirely in his head, and the afternoons teaching them how to repair leather harnesses by touch. But nature, it seemed, was determined to test the foundations of their peace. It started on a Thursday evening. The wind, which had been a steady howl for days, suddenly shifted. It dropped in pitch, becoming a low, guttural roar that vibrated through the floorboards. The temperature plummeted so fast that the sap in the logs of the cabin popped like rifle fire. And the snow, which had been light and powdery, turned into heavy, wet sleet. Elias was sitting by the hearth, weaving a horsehair bridle, when he suddenly stopped. He tilted his head, his sightless eyes narrowing as he tuned out the crackle of the fire and the chatter of the children playing on the rug. "Caleb," Elias said, his voice cutting through the room's warmth with sudden urgency. "Get your coat. We need to go to the barn." Maeve looked up from her knitting, a sudden spike of anxiety in her chest. "Elias, what is it?" "The roof," Elias replied, standing up and reaching for his heavy wool coat on the peg by the door. Listen to the wind, Maeve. It's carrying wet snow. The barn roof is pitched but not steep enough for this kind of weight. The timber is old. If we don't clear it now, the crossbeams will snap before midnight. Caleb was already pulling on his boots, his face pale. The horses are in there, Pa. And the milk cows. I know, Elias said grimly. Grab the wide shovels and a coil of thick rope. Maeve pushed herself up from her chair, her hand instinctively resting on her swollen belly. Elias, it's a blizzard out there. You can't go up on a slick, sloped roof in the pitch dark. You can't see the edges. I don't need to see the edges, Maeve, Elias said, stepping toward her and placing his cold hands on her cheeks. I know the exact dimensions of that roof. I built it. If it caves in, we lose our spring stock and we starve next winter. I have to go. Then I'm coming with you, Maeve insisted, her voice trembling. No, Elias commanded gently but firmly. You are staying here. You keep the fire hot. You keep the little ones calm. Caleb will be my eyes. We tie off to the central beam. We'll be safe. 10 minutes later, Elias and Caleb plunged into the roaring whiteout. The cold was a physical wall that stole the breath from their lungs. The 50 yards from the house to the barn felt like 50 miles. Elias walked ahead, using a long wooden pole to test the depth of the drifts, shielding his son from the brunt of the wind. When they reached the barn, the situation was worse than Elias had predicted. Even over the storm, Elias could hear the ominous, deep-throated groaning of the massive wooden crossbeams bending under the immense weight of the wet snow. "The ladder is on the south wall, Caleb," Elias shouted over the wind. "Guide me." They climbed the icy rungs, the wind trying to tear them off and cast them into the darkness. When they reached the top, Elias instructed Caleb to tie the thick hemp rope securely around Caleb's waist, looping the other end tightly around his own. They were tethered together, a blind giant and a 14-year-old boy standing on an icy, slanted precipice. "Listen to me, Caleb," Elias roared. "Do not step near the eaves. Stay close to the central spine of the roof. You tell me where the drifts are heaviest, and you let me do the heavy lifting." For 2 agonizing hours, they fought the storm. It was a brutal, exhausting ballet. Caleb would shout directions. 3 feet to your left, Pa, huge drift." And Elias would move with terrifying confidence, his massive shoulders driving the shovel into the heavy snow, heaving it off the edge into the void. Elias couldn't see the dizzying drop. He couldn't see the blinding snow. He only felt the incline of the slick shingles beneath his boots, the tension of the rope connecting him to his son, and the screaming burn in his muscles. He worked like a machine, driven by the absolute necessity of protecting his family's future. Suddenly, a loud, sharp crack echoed from directly beneath Elias's boots. "Pa! The beam!" Caleb screamed, terrified. The roof bowed violently. Elias felt the wood giving way beneath him. Without a second thought, he lunged backward, grabbing the rope that connected him to Caleb, and hauled his son toward the reinforced spine of the roof, just as a 10-foot section of the lower eaves collapsed, sending a massive avalanche of snow and broken timber crashing to the ground below. Elias wrapped his arms around Caleb, pinning the boy to the solid apex of the roof, shielding him with his own body as the structure shuddered and groaned, fighting to stabilize. They lay there in the dark, the wind howling around them, gasping for air. "I got you, son," Elias breathed heavily against Caleb's coat. "I got you." Caleb was shaking uncontrollably, his hands gripping his father's coat. "We cleared enough, Pa. The main beams are holding. We cleared enough." "Then let's go home," Elias said. When they finally stumbled back through the front door of the cabin, they looked like snow ghosts. Maeve let out a sob of pure relief, rushing forward with thick towels and hot coffee. The children clustered around them, wide-eyed. Elias stripped off his frozen coat and sank heavily into his armchair by the fire. He was battered, freezing, and exhausted to his very marrow. But as Caleb recounted the story to his wide-eyed siblings, Elias felt a profound sense of peace. Maeve knelt beside Elias's chair, pressing a mug of hot coffee into his hands. "You took 10 years off my life, Elias Thorn," she whispered, her forehead resting against his knee. Elias smiled tiredly, setting the mug down and reaching out to cup her face. His thumb brushed over her cheek, then moved down to rest warmly against the curve of her belly. Just as his hand settled there, a distinct, sharp flutter pressed outward from within Maeve against his palm. It was the baby, a strong, unmistakable kick. Elias gasped softly, his sightless eyes widening. He moved his fingers, pressing gently, waiting. A second later, another kick struck his palm, greeting him in the dark. "Did you feel that?" Maeve whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "I felt it," Elias breathed, his voice thick with awe. The freezing wind battered the walls of the cabin, the snow piled high against the windows, sealing them off from the world. But inside, surrounded by his children, the warmth of the fire, and the new life kicking fiercely against his hand, Elias Thorn knew he was the richest man in the Wyoming Territory. The searing heat of late June hung over the Bighorn Valley like a suffocating wool blanket. The grass had turned the color of baked clay, and the air shimmered above the dirt roads. The doors and windows of the Thorn Ranch house were thrown wide open, desperately trying to catch any stray breeze coming off the river. But inside the main bedroom, the heat was entirely forgotten. Maeve's labor had begun before dawn, a slow, aching tightening that had steadily built into a relentless, agonizing storm. By mid-afternoon, the house was entirely focused on the bedroom. Caleb had ridden into Cheyenne at first light to fetch Mrs. Higgins, the town midwife, but they had not yet returned. The younger children had been sent out to the far pastures with strict instructions to stay out of the house. Only Elias remained with her. He sat on a sturdy wooden chair pulled right to the edge of the bed. His heavy flannel shirt was discarded, his undershirt soaked with sweat. Both of his large, calloused hands enveloped one of Maeve's. "Breathe, Maeve, just like the river." "Let it flow, don't fight the current," Elias murmured. His voice was a low, gravelly vibration, a steady drumbeat in the chaotic, pain-filled room. Maeve let out a ragged, guttural cry as another contraction ripped through her abdomen. She squeezed Elias's hands with terrifying strength, her nails digging into his skin. "Elias, it hurts. It's taking too long. Where is she? Where is the midwife?" "Caleb will bring her. But we don't need her yet," Elias lied smoothly, keeping his voice entirely level. In truth, his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was blind. He couldn't see the sweat matting her hair, couldn't see the color of her face. He was entirely reliant on sound and touch to gauge her condition. He listened to the rhythm of her breathing. He felt the tension in her muscles, the damp heat of her skin, the erratic pulse fluttering at her wrist. Every sound she made painted a vivid, terrifying picture in his mind. "I can't do this, Elias," Maeve sobbed, thrashing her head against the pillows. "Something is wrong. I'm too tired." Elias stood up. He didn't let go of her hand. He leaned over the bed, bringing his face close to hers. "Maeve Jenkins Thorn, listen to my voice." Maeve gasped, her eyes flying open to look at his scarred, sightless face, hovering just inches from hers. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known," Elias said fiercely, his words leaving no room for doubt. "You walked into a house of broken people and put us back together. You faced down Silas Vance. You faced down Arthur Pendleton. You are not going to let this defeat you. You are going to bring our child into this world, and I am going to be right here holding your hand when you do." The absolute, unshakable conviction in his voice acted like an anchor. Maeve stared at him, drawing on the immense, quiet strength that radiated from his massive frame. She took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded. Okay, Elias." An hour later, the sound of hurried boots echoed in the hallway. Caleb burst into the room, followed closely by a breathless, red-faced Mrs. Higgins, carrying a worn leather bag. "Sorry, Elias," Mrs. Higgins panted, moving swiftly to the foot of the bed. "A wagon lost a wheel on the pass, blocked the road. Let me see her." Elias didn't move from his chair. He only shifted slightly to give the midwife room. "She's exhausted, Sarah. The contractions are close, 2 minutes apart." Mrs. Higgins quickly examined Maeve. "You're right, Elias. It's time. The baby is ready. Maeve, honey, on the next pain, I need you to push with everything you have." The next hour was a blur of agony, sweat, and primal exertion. Elias became Maeve's physical anchor. When she pushed, she pulled against his arms, burying her face against his shoulder, her screams muffled by his sweat-drenched shirt. Elias didn't flinch. He whispered continuously in her ear, words of love, words of praise, anchoring her in the dark. "I see the head," Mrs. Higgins shouted triumphantly. "One more, Maeve. A big one. Give it everything." Maeve let out a final earth-shattering cry, arching her back, her fingers crushing Elias's hands. And then a sudden miraculous sound cut through the heavy summer heat. It was a sharp, furious, high-pitched wail. Elias stopped breathing. The sound hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard in his life. "It's a girl," Mrs. Higgins laughed, her voice thick with relief. "A beautiful, healthy, screaming little girl." Maeve collapsed back against the pillows, sobbing with exhaustion and pure, unadulterated joy. "Elias! Elias! It's a girl!" Mrs. Higgins quickly cleaned the infant, wrapping her tightly in a soft cotton blanket that Elias had laid out hours ago. "Here, Papa," the midwife said softly, moving to Elias's side. Elias held his arms out, his massive hands trembling violently for the first time. Mrs. Higgins placed the small, warm bundle into his arms. Elias pulled the baby to his chest. She felt impossibly light, yet she anchored his entire world. He lowered his head, breathing in the scent of her, the raw, earthy smell of new life. Slowly, with excruciating gentleness, he brought his rough, calloused right hand up to her tiny face. His fingertips, which could read the mood of a horse or the flaw in a piece of timber, now read the features of his daughter. He felt the incredibly soft, downy hair on her head. He traced the delicate arch of her tiny eyebrows. He felt the small, perfectly formed curve of her nose and the plump softness of her cheeks. As his thumb brushed her chin, the baby suddenly stopped crying. She turned her head slightly, her tiny, incredibly strong fingers grabbing hold of his massive thumb, gripping it tight. Tears, hot and silent, flowed freely from Elias's blind eyes, tracking down his weathered cheeks. "She has your chin, Elias," Maeve whispered tiredly from the bed, watching her husband meet their daughter. "And she has your dark hair." "What color are her eyes?" Elias asked, his voice choked with emotion. "Blue," Maeve smiled gently. "Like a clear summer sky." Elias leaned down and kissed the baby's incredibly soft forehead. He didn't need to see the blue of her eyes. He felt the warmth of her breath, the strong, steady beat of her tiny heart against his chest, and the fierce, unyielding grip of her fingers on his thumb. "Clara," Elias whispered into the quiet room, naming her after the light he could no longer see but felt every single day. "Her name is Clara." He stood up, carrying his newborn daughter with practiced ease, and gently laid her on Maeve's chest, wrapping his long arms around both of his girls. The darkness around Elias Thorn was absolute, but as he stood in the sweltering heat of that Wyoming bedroom, he knew his world had never been brighter. 5 years passed over the Thorn Ranch like wind over the prairie, shaping the landscape, smoothing the rough edges, and leaving undeniable marks of growth. The ranch had expanded. The original wooden cabin had been extended twice, boasting a wide wraparound porch and a grand stone fireplace that Caleb had built with his own hands. The herd was the envy of the territory, producing some of the finest beef and strongest quarter horses in Wyoming. It was a cool, crisp October afternoon. The harvest was finished, the winter feed was stored, and the valley was painted in brilliant shades of amber and gold. On the wide front porch, a scene of profound, quiet domesticity was unfolding. Elias sat in his favorite rocking chair. At 45, his hair had silvered at the temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, giving his handsome face an aristocratic, distinguished ruggedness. His blindness was no longer a tragic secret or a liability. It was simply a fact of life, as natural as the mountains that bordered their land. He was currently engaged in a very serious task. "No, Papa, you have the blue one," a bright, commanding 5-year-old voice chirped. "The red one goes here." Clara Thorn, a whirlwind of dark hair and striking, intelligent blue eyes, was sitting cross-legged on the floorboards between Elias's boots. They were playing with a set of smooth wooden blocks Elias had carved. He had carved different textures into the sides of the blocks, stripes for red, dots for blue, waves for yellow, so he could play the game with her. "Ah, my mistake, Miss Clara," Elias chuckled, his deep voice rumbling pleasantly. He ran his thumb over the block, feeling the dots. "You're right, this is blue. Where does it go?" Clara grabbed his massive hand with her small one, guiding his arm toward the precarious tower they were building. "Right on top. Gently, Papa." Elias smiled, placing the block with flawless precision. From the open kitchen window, Maeve watched them. She was wiping down the counter, pausing to take in the sight. At 43, she was radiantly happy, her face tanned and lined with the evidence of a life lived outdoors and filled with laughter. The sound of pounding hooves drew her attention to the yard. Caleb, now a towering 19-year-old and the undisputed foreman of the ranch, rode in on his massive bay gelding. He was trailed by the twins, now 13 and riding expertly beside their older brother. Caleb swung down from the saddle, tossing the reins to one of the hired hands. He bounded up the porch steps, pulling off his Stetson and wiping his brow. "Afternoon, Pa. Afternoon, Terror," Caleb teased, ruffling Clara's dark hair. Clara swatted his hand away indignantly. "We are building a castle, Caleb. Do not knock it over with your big boots." "Wouldn't dream of it," Caleb laughed. He leaned against the porch railing, looking at his father. "The south fence is secured, Pa. The river is running low, but the cattle have enough water in the lower basin. We're ready for the freeze." Elias nodded, his hands resting comfortably on his knees. "Good work, Caleb. Have you checked the inventory in the root cellar?" "Maeve already has it cataloged," Caleb said, his eyes shifting to the kitchen window where Maeve offered a small wave. "She says we have enough preserves to feed an army. Oh, and Mayor Garrett stopped me on the road. Said the town council wants you to speak at the Founders' Day gathering next month. Wants you to talk about winter herd management." Elias raised an eyebrow, a wry smile touching his lips. "The town council wants a blind man to tell them how to look after their cattle?" "You have the lowest winter mortality rate in the county, Pennsylvania," Caleb pointed out with fierce pride. "They'd be fools not to ask." "We'll see," Elias murmured, though he felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. There had been a time when the town looked at him with pity, when men like Arthur Pendleton and Silas Vance saw his darkness as a weakness to be exploited. Now they came to him for guidance. As Caleb headed inside to wash up, Lily, now 10, emerged onto the porch carrying a large, heavy book. She sat on the wooden swing, her legs swinging gently, and opened it. "Chapter 4, Papa?" Lily asked. "Chapter 4, Elias agreed, leaning back in his rocker. Lily began to read aloud, her clear voice carrying the story of Treasure Island across the porch. Elias listened, his mind effortlessly painting the ships, the ocean, and the pirates. He didn't need eyes to see the world. His children brought the world to him, painting it in vibrant, loving detail every single day. An hour later, the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, cool shadows across the yard. The children had scattered inside to help with dinner. The screen door creaked, and Maeve stepped out. She held 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She walked over, handing one to Elias before sitting on the wide arm of his rocking chair, leaning her side against his chest. Elias instinctively wrapped his free arm around her waist, pulling her close. He pressed his face into her shoulder, breathing in the scent of vanilla, lye soap, and the crisp autumn air. "It's a beautiful evening," Maeve said softly, watching the sky turn brilliant shades of violet and gold. "Describe it to me," Elias murmured, his eyes closed, his heart entirely at peace. "The sky is clear," Maeve began, her voice a soothing melody. "The sun is hitting the snow on the very top of the bighorns, making it look like the mountains are glowing from the inside. The cottonwoods down by the creek have turned completely yellow. It looks like a ribbon of gold running through the valley." Elias listened, his hand gently stroking her waist. He could see it perfectly. "Do you ever miss it?" Maeve asked quietly, her fingers brushing through his silvering hair. "Seeing it with your own eyes?" Elias was silent for a long moment. He listened to the faint sounds of his children laughing inside the house. He felt the solid, unyielding warmth of the woman who had saved him from the abyss. He thought about the life they had built, a fortress of love, respect, and unshakable loyalty forged in the fires of adversity. "No," Elias said finally, and it was the absolute, unvarnished truth. He lifted his head, his sightless, scarred eyes looking out toward the horizon he could no longer see. "When I had my sight, Maeve, I looked at this land and saw dirt and money and pride," Elias explained, his voice low and vibrating with emotion. "I saw what I owned. But when the darkness came, when I had to rely on you, and on Caleb, and on the strength of this family to survive," he reached up, his rough fingers tracing the line of her jaw, incredibly tender. "I lost my eyes, Maeve, but it was only in the dark that I finally learned how to see." Maeve smiled, a single tear slipping down her cheek, and leaned down to kiss him as the last light of the Wyoming sun faded behind the mountains, leaving them enveloped in a perfect, beautiful night. The story you're about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
The story of Elias Thorn and Maeve Jenkins is not simply a tale of the American West. It is, at its core, a profound meditation on what it truly means to see, to love, and to belong. At first glance, Elias appears to be a man defined by control, rigid, distant, almost unkind. His house is ordered like a machine, his rules suffocating, his presence heavy with authority. But as the truth unfolds, we realize that what looks like control is, in fact, fear. Elias is not trying to dominate his world. He is desperately trying to hold on to it, piece by piece, as his vision slowly fades into darkness. And here lies the first great lesson of the story. We must never judge a person solely by what we see on the surface. Often the harshest behaviors are born not from cruelty, but from pain. Behind silence, behind anger, behind control, there is often fear, vulnerability, and a desperate attempt to survive. Maeve represents the second pillar of meaning in this story, courage rooted in compassion. She does not walk away when she discovers Elias's secret. She does not pity him, nor does she try to replace him. Instead, she chooses something far more difficult. She chooses to stand beside him, not above him, not in front of him, but beside him. This is a powerful moral lesson about love and partnership. True love is not about rescuing someone or fixing them. It is about walking with them through their darkest moments, offering strength without taking away their dignity. Maeve becomes Elias's eyes, but she never takes away his role as a father, as a man, as the foundation of his family. Another deep message lies in Elias's transformation. At the beginning, he believes that blindness will make him a burden, that losing his sight means losing his worth. This belief is something many people carry in different forms. We often tie our value to our abilities, our strength, or what we can provide. But the story challenges that idea. Elias does not lose his worth when he loses his sight. In fact, he discovers a deeper kind of strength, one that does not rely on vision, but on memory, instinct, courage, and love. In the blizzard, when even sighted men are blind, Elias becomes the one who can lead. In the river, he becomes the one who saves. In his family, he becomes the one who anchors everything. This leads us to one of the most important lessons of all. Our limitations do not define us. Our response to them does. The story also speaks powerfully about family, not just blood, but chosen bonds. Elias chooses to raise children who are not all his by blood. Maeve chooses to stay and build a home that was never originally hers. And the children, in turn, choose loyalty, love, and unity over comfort and wealth when faced with the chance to leave. Family in this story is not something you are born into. It is something you build through sacrifice, through trust, and through showing up again and again, even when it is hard. Perhaps the most beautiful idea in this story is the redefinition of seeing. Elias loses his physical sight, yet gains something far more meaningful. He begins to see through touch, through sound, through memory, and most importantly, through love. By the end of the story, he understands something that many people with perfect vision never do: that life is not truly seen with the eyes, but with the heart. And that is the final lesson this story leaves us with. We often believe that clarity comes from what we can see, but true clarity comes from what we feel, what we value, and who we choose to stand beside. Darkness, in many ways, strips away illusion and reveals what truly matters. In the end, Elias does not regain his sight, but he gains something greater: a life filled with love, purpose, family, and peace. And that is a reminder to all of us. Sometimes losing something we think we cannot live without is the very thing that teaches us how to truly live.